Hello, welcome to part 3 of this series of talks on living through collective trauma. And needless to say, the collective trauma that we're talking about is COVID-19 that all of us are going through right now. In this series, we've been looking at what the idea of trauma is, what it means to be in a space where the world as a whole is traumatized. And therefore, even as we would much like to support our near and dear ones, we also very much need to make sure that we take care of ourselves and ensure that we support ourselves first. So in the first two parts of the series, we've looked at a simple exercise in grounding that will help us make sure that we are able to manage our own highs and lows in the process of going through the pandemic. And in the second part of the series, we also spoke about self-care tips at various layers of our being. Self-care tips in the context of our physical health, our emotional and mental health, as well as our social health. Today, we are going to be talking about grief. And this is grief that we are going through as a community. Of course, not all of us may have endured personal losses in the process of COVID-19, yet we are living in an environment where there is loss, and hence it's important to address the nature of this grief. Now, we may have ourselves personally encountered or have encountered through people around us losses of various natures since the time the pandemic started. We may have encountered death, physical death and loss of dear ones. We may have encountered losses of other kinds. For example, some of us may have encountered losses of jobs or business opportunities. We may have encountered losses in our enterprises and our professional lives because there are opportunities that were missed in the process of going through lockdowns. For some of us, there may have been a whole lot of financial loss. Most of us seem to have faced a loss of connection. And what we mean by loss of connection is that sense of physically being with, hanging around with people that give us joy. And this is something that continues to be a challenge, given that there are some parts of the world that are still in lockdown or in a semi-lockdown space. Isolation continues for a large part of the world population. And there is definitely a loss of connection, of human relationships for people that we care to be around with. There is, needless to say, loss in terms of our physical health, in the sense that even if we may be personally relatively healthy, the regular opportunities that we have to sustain our health, which could include outdoor exercises, being able to also hang out with people that contribute to our positive mental health and so on. Those are opportunities that are lost in the process of the pandemic and the aftermath of it. And naturally, there is grief around all of this. Yes, we do tend to utilize the term grief and trauma in very specific ways when it comes to colloquial vocabulary. However, it's important to understand that what we are going through is a sense of grief, a sense of having lost something that was previously accessible to us. That, in a psychological sense, is grief. And trauma, as we described earlier in the series, is any time where there is a breach of boundaries. And in the context of COVID-19, there has been several breaches of boundaries, including the fact that our workspace has entered our home boundaries. We work from home. Another breach of boundary is that continued sense of loss of personal space for those of us who may be living in houses with several people in it, and we may not quite have the private space that we could otherwise access when we could freely go in and out of the whole house. So there are several kinds of trauma and layers of grief that each of us experience. And even if we personally may not have a heightened sense of trauma or grief, this is present in our environment, and that makes us vulnerable. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross speaks of this beautiful cycle of grief, and when acknowledged and worked with actively, it is something that can help us as a tool to process our grief, not just for ourselves, but also for people around us that we may wish to suffer. The first step when we encounter grief of any kind is quite naturally denial. We attempt to avoid labeling it as grief. We attempt to stay strong through the process. We attempt to sometimes negate the shock or even the fear that we feel around grief. For example, when the pandemic began in 2020, a lot of responses that we saw around social media was about this desire to return to a new normal, trying to stay strong through the pandemic, trying to support each other, and not quite acknowledge the fact that there is loss, there is grief, there is fear. And that's a classic expression of denial that we noticed at the collective level. And I'm sure a lot of us may also relate to having gone through this as individuals. Once the stage of denial passes, eventually we enter a stage of anger. Now, it may be heightened anger and rage for some of us. Some of us may experience anger in its milder forms. We may experience a continued sense of irritation, a sense of worry, frustration about the uncertainty that does not seem to ease away for over a year now. And that's a very natural part of the grief cycle. And it is important that we acknowledge it, we're not ashamed of it, and we allow for healthy expression, healthy conversation around this anger that we experience individually and collectively. Once we allow for expression of this anger, we may feel low, and yet this low is a healthy low. It is a space where we now start negotiating, renegotiating with life. Right? There's an internal sense of bargaining where we now start to look at, how do I make meaning now? How do I make sense of this new so-called normal, this new baseline that I need to exist in? And this is a critical space. It is not a high energy space. It is not a space where we may feel great about ourselves. And yet it is a space where we start reaching out to one another. And we may have experienced this ourselves since the pandemic started, in terms of having gone through the first few months of lockdown and then slowly reaching out to people, calling up old friends, calling up people that you've not had time to reach out to in your otherwise busy lives. This is a very natural process of bargaining. And as I speak, you may notice that the cycle of grief is more often than not an intuitive process. We may have gone through this in a very natural way, in a way that we did not quite think about, and yet it came to us as we processed our grief naturally. However, the reason we are speaking about this cycle is so as to bring it to our conscious awareness and to not halt the process. A lot of times our social training, our conditioning ends up coming in the way of this natural grief cycle. We don't allow ourselves to get past denial. Sometimes we don't allow ourselves or even people around us to express anger and frustration freely. And in the process, we don't quite allow ourselves to get to the process of bargaining, of renegotiating with life. As we go through the process of bargaining, It's natural to feel depressed. It's very natural to feel low because this is a process where we start openly acknowledging our grief, and we also start voicing it out. We verbalize it. We use words to describe it to ourselves and to others. And in the process, it's okay to feel depressed. It's okay to feel overwhelmed, to feel low, to feel helpless. And sometimes in the process, we may also experience a resurgence of anger, and that's perfectly all right. It's a natural part of the process. It's only when we go through this that we come to a stage of acceptance where we realize that here is what life is like right now. The losses that have happened. And now we start slowly creating a plan for moving on from here in a healthy manner, in a manner that we often refer to as getting to the new normal. Now, you will notice that the only way out from the cycle is through it. There is no escaping it. There is no shame in it. It is something that all of us are going through. And the more conscious we are about it, the more we are able to recognize each of these steps in the process, we will be able to better support ourselves and support people around us when we start noticing which part of the process they are in. A few tips to wrap up this conversation is please allow for free expression for yourselves and for people around you when you're going through this communal grief. One thing that certainly helps is to engage in physical movement. And this movement may look different for different people. For some of us, it could be light exercises, it could be going out for a walk, it could be dancing. For some of us, we may have a more rigorous kind of a workout routine. Either way, it's okay. But the point is, we need to provide for physical movement. The body has its own intelligence and ways to release grief, and physical movement is one of them. So please engage in whatever kind of movement suits you. Also, do make sure that you find safe ways of expressing feelings. Some of us may have the privilege of being able to express it verbally to people that we trust. For some of us, we may want to find other ways of expression, which could include doodling, it could include writing it out, it could be journaling, it could be blogging. Find ways that are safe. If you wish, and if you wish to protect your privacy, you may want to sometimes write out something and perhaps destroy or discard the piece of paper that you've written on. But it's important to express, nevertheless. And throughout this process, please remember, vulnerability is not a weakness. Vulnerability is a strength. It is essential for our mental health. So if you feel vulnerable or if you feel people around you are vulnerable, please in that moment allow for it. Please do not ask yourself or others to stay strong. Strength comes from expression of vulnerability, not from denial of it. And finally, there are several resources that you can access to as we go through this process of grieving communally. One resource that I particularly recommend is this link that you see on the screen. If you wish to go to this link, you might want to pause this talk here and make a note of this link. And this link is a website that is managed by the United States Department of Veteran Affairs. And on this link, you will find access to several free apps, free mobile apps, which include apps for stress management. There is also a very specific app that is called the COVID Coach. And each of these are free to download for people around the world. And they give you tips, tricks, tools to be able to manage what we are going through in the process of the pandemic. So that's a very valuable resource, and you might want to look it up for yourself and for people that you care about. That's it for this conversation today around communal grieving as we live through the collective trauma that is COVID-19. I will see you in the next talk in the series. Take care.
Help Talks are daily health-related talks held at Health Education Library for People, Mumbai, India. For more information visit www.healthlibrary.com. Subscribe to Help Talks channel. Be better informed about your health.